Hello there, and welcome back. It's time to hop into Nuke and go over one of the most exciting videos in this entire workshop, the Nuke User Interface. Now, when you first load up Nuke, this is what your default layout will look like. It brings to the front the three most important panels that you'll be using, and those are the Viewer, the Properties panel, and the node graph panel. So a quick overview, because I don't want to spend too long on this, but the node graph is where we're going to be building our node trees and where we can visualize the flow of data. The properties panel will contain specific controls for the nodes in our node graph, and we'll be able to see the results of these controls in the viewer. The viewer allows us to see the output of a given node. Now let's start making our first node tree so we can see these panels in action. So there's really three main ways of creating nodes in Nuke, and I'll show them to you, starting with the slowest and moving on to the fastest. So the slowest way is to use this node browser over here. This has every single node you could want to use in Nuke and every single node that you currently have installed. So we're going to make a checkerboard right here. So we're going to go to the image tab and then hit checkerboard. And there's our node. You'll notice that on node creation, we immediately got a properties panel tab that has a name that's one-to-one with the created node. And I just zoomed in here. Zooming in your node graph is using your middle mouse wheel to scroll, and clicking and holding your middle mouse wheel is how you move around. And so checkerboard one, these correspond with each other always. So if we were to change this to, this is the one, all right, this updated once we entered that name. So we can't really control anything of this checkerboard within the node graph. The only thing we can really do is turn it off and on, which we'll look at once we're viewing our node. All of the adjustable controls live within this property panel. So that's one way to make a node. Let's delete this. Just hit delete there. That gets rid of it. And now let's make a checkerboard in a faster way. So when you're in your node graph, make sure you click around just so this is the context we're in. Hit tab. So tab opens a search bar where you can look for any node that Nuke currently has loaded. So in this instance, checkerboard's already loaded because I recently searched for it, but just type in checkerboard, have it selected, and hit enter. All right, we just made a brand new checkerboard node. Using this tab menu when you're first starting can be a little intimidating because it requires you to know the name of the node. It's okay if at first you don't know the name of the nodes and you don't really use the tab browser. Over time, you'll get to know them, and really, that left window over there is a great way to just see what nodes exist in Nuke. So I highly recommend you click through them and just see what the different nodes do. And then once you start feeling comfortable, you'll be in this tab menu constantly. I don't think I ever use this in my day-to-day work. So then the next way we can make nodes is you'll notice when you're clicking through, there are shortcuts to make specific nodes in here, and that is by far the fastest way. A lot of these don't have shortcuts. The checkerboard, for instance, doesn't, but say we wanted to add a color correct node. We would just hit C. And now we've made a color correct node using a shortcut. If we go to the node browser on the left here and look at our color correct, and you'll notice that it has C as a shortcut. So that's a good way to figure out what the shortcuts are for some very commonly used nodes. So let's actually get to viewing all these nodes that we've made. So the viewer itself actually is a node, and it has an input here. All nodes that can accept data into them have this little arrow at the top. You see it on our viewer here, and you also see it on our color correct node. Our checkerboard can't take data into it, so there's no arrow at the top. So to connect our checkerboard to our viewer, there's a couple different ways we can do it. The first is we grab this input and connect it here, and voila, there we are. Here's our checkerboard. We navigate the viewer panel the same way that we navigate the node graph. You click and drag with the middle mouse button, and you scroll in and out to get closer. Now, if you want to just fit this to your screen, hit H. No matter where you are, that'll always center you and bring you back to your home format. So that's one way you can connect it. Another way is you could actually grab the output of this node. You'll notice that the checkerboard and the color corrects here have outputs, and you can connect that to the viewer. I very rarely see people use this output arrow, but if you like it, go ahead. It's just another way of working. So there's one more way to connect nodes, except this one is for your viewer only. If you want to connect this node to your viewer, just have it selected and hit 1. Now whatever we had picked is going to jump to our viewer. If we select this color correct, there's no actual image flowing through it. The color correct doesn't make images, but instead it adjusts them. That's why our image is currently black. So let's go back to our checkerboard by selecting it and hitting 1. So if we double click here, it'll bring the checkerboard properties to the top, and we can actually see the modifications to the controls that we do now. So if we change the size of the squares here, you'll see it live update within our viewer. All of these parameters can only be controlled within this properties tab. There's no control that you have over nodes aside from turning them off and on in the node graph. And you do that by hitting D. D stands for disabled, and that's just a quick shortcut to turn things off and on. If you go into the node panel here, which every single node has, you'll notice that when we hit D, we're actually turning on the disable here. Again, you very rarely ever go in here to manually disable a node. The only time you're in here is if you're adding expressions, which we'll go over later. I'm always hitting the D key in order to turn things off. So now we have a checkerboard here and we have a color correct. But if I change the color correct properties, and again, double click it to have it go to the top, nothing's happening. And that's because our viewer is not connected in any way to our color correct. So let's connect it here. Well, we see, again, nothing has changed. And that's because we essentially have two flows of data here. And the one that is connected to our viewer does not involve our color correct. All our viewer is doing is looking at our checkerboard node. So let's connect it here to our color correct, and you'll immediately see it gets brighter. So now we can modify our color correct properties here, and they will directly affect our viewer. And if we were to turn this off, it's just our normal checkerboard. So in general, when you're making nodes, the flow should always be straight down. You never, ever, ever want to build nodes that flow up. Sideways is occasionally acceptable, but up is never good. The industry standard is a downward flowing node tree, so you can clearly see the flow of data. Another way to use the viewer, say you want to A/B very quickly between our base checkerboard and this color correct. Now you could quickly do that by just turning it off and on, but say this was a stack of nodes. Say we had also a blur on top of it. Now let's make a blur by hitting the tab menu and typing blur. We'll just select that there. All right, we have our blur node. And you'll notice when we had a node selected, it immediately created this node in line with it. If nothing was selected here and I hit tab and typed blur, it would just be off to the side, not doing anything. So let's delete this. Let's grab our blur and blur it out. Okay, beautiful. Now let's set up our viewer so we can quickly A/B the original checkerboard with our color corrected and blurred version. We can hit 1 to connect this to our viewer's first input, and then we can actually hit 2 with our blur 1 selected. And this makes another input for our viewer. If we have our viewer selected, you can see that the second input is lit up. This indicates that we're looking through the viewer's second input. But if we hit 1, it switches back to our first input. Now flipping back and forth is a very helpful way of A/Bing, but there's another way that's even better. We can use the wipe tool. So the wipe tool is in the viewer, and if you hit wipe right here, it's going to A/B what we have here in A and what we have in B. So if you click on B, you'll see they're both connected to our first viewer input right now, and that's not what we want. So let's hit blur. You'll see on the right side of screen, we've actually loaded our second input. Now you can grab this widget to modify your wipe. You can rotate it, you can change the opacity. There's a lot of different things you can do here, but this tool is very useful for A/Bing your final result with the footage. You can also hit W to turn it off and on as a shortcut. So let's look into bringing in some actual footage and how to play it back. So let's delete all of the nodes we've made by shift dragging, letting go, and hitting delete. So let's bring some footage into Nuke. The way you bring footage into Nuke is through a node called the read node. The read node is the most important node in Nuke because it's how you get any images, any movie files, any elements at all that are pictures into Nuke. And there are 3 different ways of creating read nodes. The first and the slowest is going up here to our image tab and then hitting read. So this will open Nuke's file browser. I have now navigated to where my footage is located. I will select it and then hit open. Now this brings in a read node. So let's view it with our viewer by selecting it and hitting 1. And here it is. We'll just fit this to our screen, hitting H and hit play in our viewer. And there it is. We have successfully brought footage into Nuke. That is the slowest way of bringing footage in. Let's just delete this really quick and bring in it again. Now, you can type read here. It'll open up the same window. Anytime you make a read node, this window is going to pop up and ask you what footage to bring in. So you can use the tab menu. We know how to do that. And the shortcut is R. This is the most common way I do it because, again, it's just so much faster. And once again, we have our footage in. You can also use the Windows Explorer window if you wish. If we wanted to bring both of these in, we could select both of them and drag them in, and they would come in as separate read nodes. This is the same one that we have here. We'll hit 2, and this is our second piece of footage. So to briefly summarize, you can bring in read nodes by using the panel on the left, by hitting R in the node graph, or by dragging and dropping from the Windows Explorer. And if you need to bring in multiple pieces of footage, you can also do that with Nuke's File Explorer. Let's hit R, and that'll bring up our Explorer, and select our footage 01, then hit Next, then we'll select our footage 02, and then we'll hit Open, and that brings in both of our read nodes. I'm just going to delete this one for now because we don't really need it. And within our viewer window, we have our playback controls right here. So let's just hit play. So right now, Nuke is caching, and the cache is represented by this yellow bar here. It basically means that whatever is in yellow is ready to be played back at full speed. This isn't as important here since all we're doing is looking at footage, but in heavier comps, it's essential. Now let's take a look at some of the read nodes properties. So over here, we have the file path. If we ever wanted to change what image we're viewing, you could click here and select a different one. All right, this has loaded our footage 2 element, and I'm just clicking and scrubbing here, and you can see it's caching individual frames when I stay on it long enough for the program to think about it. So we have our new footage here. We have our format size. This tells us the resolution of our footage, and within the viewer, we can actually see it here as well. This bottom number is our format size, while this top number is our bounding box size. These are 2 very different concepts within Nuke and can briefly be summarized as the format is what our final image output will be, and the bounding box is all the data that Nuke is calculating. We'll go into more detail into this next week, but it is important to know that there is a difference between these 2 numbers. But for now, just know that this bottom number would be the final resolution if you were to render your image at that point in the node tree. Next up in our read node property options are the proxy knobs. Now proxies are basically low-res placeholders for your high-res clips. It's something that enables very heavy comps to work more smoothly and efficiently. Proxies are very important when we're setting up heavy CG scenes, and we'll take a look at how to use them later. Next are our frame settings. So the frame range and original range, right now they're displaying the same thing. They're saying the first frame within this MOV file is frame 1, and our last frame is frame 178. And it's also telling us what to do once we reach beyond this frame range. So right now we're going from 1 to 178. And what we're doing is we're freeze framing if we go before frame 1. So let's just grab our viewer here. All right, we're negative 50 right now, and it's just a frame hold of the first frame. If we were to change this to black, the screen will be black until we hit frame 1. Now there are a couple of other options you can pick. We have loop, which will just loop the clip forever, and we have bounce, which is like loop, but it plays it forwards and then backwards, and then repeats. So this will just play back and forth infinitely before frame 1, but after frame 178, it's still set to hold. I'm just going to keep this to hold for now. That's a pretty good default, and I don't really ever change this. The original range and frame range will by default be the same coming into Nuke, but you can change this so you're only loading a portion of the frames. This is particularly helpful if you have a lengthy image sequence but you don't want to load all the frames. The original range is saying, here's the entirety of my clip, but in this case, let's just say I only want to go to frame 100. After frame 100, it's going to hold our image. Go back to 178. This frame mode setting here represents a couple of different ways that we can time offset our footage. Expression is basically saying, hey, whatever frame I'm on in Nuke, load that frame of my file. So right now, we're on frame 100 in Nuke, and you can go to the metadata panel to look at the actual frame that's being displayed, and you'll find that we're at frame 100. That's how the expression mode works when there's nothing in there. You can also put Nuke expressions in that blank spot, but we're not going to cover that right now. You could also change the start at. Let's go to frame 10 to see an example of this. And we can say, okay, we want frame 1 to start at frame 10. So now you can see our clip is offset 10 frames and we'll just play 10 frames later. You can also change the offset, which is kind of the opposite of the start at. This is how many frames in negative space you're moving your footage. You can also go into the dope sheet, which normally displays keyframes, but for read nodes and time offset nodes, it'll actually display a timeline of sorts. You can click and drag the clip to move it around, almost like it's a non-linear editor. And by doing that, it'll actually change your offset value. Now, having your offset value at 0 is actually the exact same thing as being set to expression with a blank input. Now, the next knob we have coming up is the missing frames knob. So missing frames is if you have an image sequence and say a frame is missing for any reason, this option is what Nuke will do when it gets to that missing frame. Error means it'll show an error at the top of your viewport. Black will display an empty frame. Nearest frame will show the nearest frame, and checkerboard will show a checkerboard. In general, error or checkerboard is the way to go, because then it'll be very obvious when files are missing. If your image sequence is of something that's very tiny in the background and you just select blank or nearest frame, it may be hard to tell that there's an actual error. The next settings we have are the color space, pre-multiplication, and alpha options. These are a little more complicated, so we're going to hold off on talking about them for right now and break them down in later weeks. And these options, I never touch them, and you probably won't need to either. They're more detailed options for using your QuickTime files, but again, I never use them, so I don't think they're very important to know about. And there we have it. Those are the basics of using the Nuke interface and reading and playing footage. Now that we have this fundamental step out of the way, we can move on and start doing some actual compositing. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.